Quick show of hands to get us started today. How many ever bought something online, like eBay or Craigslist, not from a store, but from an individual? Okay? Like buying from an individual who's selling something. Had that experience? Okay. If you spent much time shopping online, and I don't want to admit how much I have, maybe you've had this experience. You find exactly what you're looking for at an incredible price, and it's just almost too good to be true, but just one problem. No pictures. And it tends to happen more when you're just buying from like an individual person on eBay or Craigslist. Now, I know what some of you serious online shoppers are thinking right now. Dude, you can do a search where it only shows ads that have pictures, so you didn't have to bother with the ones that don't have pics. Yes, I know that. Thank you. I do know about that option. But for some reason, somewhere, something deep down inside of me, I think if I select that option, it feels like I'm going to miss out on something. You know the old saying that a picture's worth, 1,000 words? Well, when it comes to buying stuff online, that's just true times like infinity. Hardly anybody wants to bid on what they can't see. Bidding without pics? This week, we're continuing our series, Obey, and we're doing this whole eBay thing because the way eBay works many times is a lot like how Obey works. Like, for instance, how oftentimes we're asked to obey God without really being able to see the whole picture, what exactly we'll get or what will happen if we do. Each week in this series, we're looking at a different story from the Bible, from the first half of the Bible, the most ancient part of the Bible, which is called, obviously, the Old Testament. So today we're looking at something in the Old Testament. It's a story of a guy who was called by God to obey in a way that, to me, is basically like buying something online without pics. Only difference is the stakes are much, much higher. In the very, very first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, we meet this guy. Pretty normal guy. When we first meet him, he's called by a name that's different than the name that maybe you've heard before and the one that he gets eventually remembered for. Originally, this guy's name was Abram. Somebody say Abram. Abram, thank you. And Abram was married to a woman named Sarai. Somebody say Sarai. Sarai. Abram and Sarai. And from all we can tell, Abram and Sarai were doing pretty well financially. Pretty well off, living pretty comfortably. Then one day, God shows up and says something that just changes everything. Okay? Here we go. This is from Genesis. It says this. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not much of a planner. For me, advanced planning is deciding 100 yards in advance which fast food drive-thru to pick when Wendy's and Taco Bell are right next to each other. But still, if God showed up to me, and even though I'm not a planner, and he told me to head out with me and my whole household and family and all, without giving me any specific instructions about where exactly I was going, I'm pretty sure I would try to convince God to give me some kind of picture about where I was headed. I mean, at least Google Maps or something. But God asked this basically comfortably well-off guy. He's average, but otherwise, he is comfortably well-off. He asked this guy just to pull up stakes and move with no indication of his destination. I mean, sure, there's that promise of blessing, and that sounds good, but you know how it is. A lot of offers sound good. Oh, and something else I didn't tell you about Abram. As far as we can tell, he had never been spoken to by God before. As far as we know, this was the first time. And he decides to obey with very little information about where obeying is going to lead him. So he goes home. Well, the Bible actually doesn't say this, but I imagine him going home and saying to his wife Sarai, "Sarai, pack up, we're moving." And if you're married or have ever been married, can you imagine that conversation? I imagine it going something like this. Abram goes home and says, "Honey, pack up everything, we're moving." And she's like, "We are? Where are we moving to?" And then he says, "Well, he didn't say exactly." And she says, "He didn't say? Who didn't say?" And then Abram says, "God." And then Sarai says, "God? God who?" And then Abram says, "Well, he didn't really say that either." And here's why I imagine it that way. See, they lived in a culture that believed in a whole bunch of gods and goddesses, but it was always a particular god, like a god of agriculture or war or god of the river or god of financial blessing. It was basically like, here a god, there a god, everywhere a god. But this God is just called the Lord. So Sarai had to be like, oh, I see. Some God starts speaking to you and doesn't even tell you which God he is and says we're supposed to move to a place. He doesn't even tell you where it is, and you told him we would? And Abram says, yeah. Personally, I have no idea how Abram ever talked Sarai into it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it was some old school thing where Abram, pulled rank on her or something. I don't know. But one way or another, Abram and Sarai pack up their life and just go. Last week, I helped my son move from California to North Carolina for graduate school. And though I grew up near North Carolina, I've never driven to the part of North Carolina where he was moving to. I'd been there once just flying in and flying out, but I'd never, actually driven through that part of North Carolina. So I fly into LA and we set out on this 2,600 plus mile trip together in his little Hyundai crammed with all his stuff. And it was fun, but I gotta tell you, it was a little unsettling to be driving roads I'd never been on before to get to a place I'd never driven to before. But at least I knew where we were heading, and I did have Google Maps guiding me. The voice of the goddess Siri was telling us where to turn and how far we had to go, all the way. The hard part, but there was a hard part. The hard part for me is that my son is starting grad school at Duke. And all my life, I've been a Tar Heel fan. And now my oldest son is a Duke Blue Devil? Oh, man. Don't you feel sorry for me? Anyhow, but I did what Siri told me, and we made it. It took 3.5 days of hard driving, but we made it. And obviously that is small potatoes compared to what Abram and Sarai did when they obeyed God and hit the road not knowing where they're going. But I love their story because it's a story for anybody who has any interest in spiritual things. As we said in week 1, in the words of one of the great theologians of the 20th century, only he who believes obeys, and only he who obeys believes. And if you've been on any kind of a spiritual journey for very long, you probably know something about God wanting you to do something without giving you much info of where it's going to lead you or what it's going to lead you to. There's an old song I grew up singing in church called Trust and Obey. Anybody old school enough to remember that old song, Trust and Obey? The chorus of it says, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And we all know what trust often entails. It often means doing what somebody tells you to do without any guarantee of, what's going to happen or where it's going to lead you. And who really likes that? I mean, planner or not, spontaneous or not, when the stakes are high, when what we want, when the item we want is expensive, but there aren't any picks, who really wants to bid on that? God said he'd bless them and the whole world would be blessed through them. That's a great deal, but still, no picks. But here's a little equation that anybody interested in this whole Jesus thing, I think, needs to know about. Here's this equation. The equation goes like this. Trust plus obey equals faithfulness. Trust plus obey equals faithfulness. Say it with me, okay? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Trust plus obey equals, faithfulness. Faithfulness, super important word. And we need to know about bidding without picks because a lot of us are Abrams and Sarais right now. God's telling us to do something. And yeah, he does say he'll bless our obedience, but he's not saying how he's going to bless our obedience or where our obedience is going to lead us. I mean, for some of us, maybe it's a marriage thing. Odds are somebody with us today feels like just giving up on a crappy marriage, throwing in the towel, just settling for living like roommates or whatever. But except for in the most extreme cases, God doesn't say give up on your marriage, settle for crappy. God says love and honor and cherish, regardless of whether love, honor, and cherish are coming your way or not. And God does not say, if you will obey, here's what will happen. This will happen in your marriage. That will happen in your marriage. I mean, he does say he'll bless your obedience, but he doesn't say how or when. He doesn't say, obey, and he'll be renewing your wedding vows next spring in Hawaii. No, he just says trust and obey. Some of us here today, no doubt, are single. And I know single folks don't like being reminded of this, but God's calling single folks who are Christ followers to obey him by only marrying another Christ follower. And it's not a discrimination thing. It's about not settling for trying to build a life with somebody who's working off a different set of blueprints. And then on top of that, God says to single Christ followers, he says, I want you to stay sexually pure as a single person. I mean, even if you've not been so in this area up till now, starting today, God says, I want you to live sexually pure as a single person so you can have a marriage that is sexually pure and uncomplicated by any more ghosts from your sexual past. But has God given you that command, single person, with pictures attached of Mr. or Miss Right? A happy marriage, 2.5 kids, nice house someplace. I mean, I wish I could say he's saying that, but I can't. He's just saying, trust and obey. I mean, some of us, probably a whole lot of us, if not all of us, God's asking us to be more generous than ever before, in order to bless the world. And God says he will bless us. But does he say exactly how and when and what particular way? Wish I could say yes, but I can't. He just says trust and obey. I could go through just a whole bunch of scenarios where God is calling all of us to obey in some way without picks. In how we raise our kids, in how we do our jobs, in how we love our neighbors, and how we spend our time. I mean, you name it. And it's going to be hard because so many times there just are no picks. There's just God saying trust and obey. And here's God's deal. Here's what obeying without picks is all about. I tell you the story of Abram and Sarai in the Old Testament. It's in the Old Testament. And I tell you that story because over in the end of the New Testament, there's another book called Hebrews. And Hebrews says this to us. Look what it says in Hebrews. It says, now faith, and there's that word for trust plus obey, because trust plus obey equals faithfulness. And when it says faith there, it means real faithfulness. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. See? It's talking about bidding with no picks. And I mentioned this text to you because look what it says next. It says, by faith, Abraham, which is the name that Abram is remembered for, Abram becomes remembered as Abraham because God changed his name from Abram to Abraham later in his life, after he obeyed without picks. Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. See, there it is again. It's in the Old Testament, and there it is again towards the end of the New Testament. Obeying with no picks. And then this text is really interesting because it goes on to list all these people throughout the history of God's people who obeyed without a clear picture of what their obedience would bring. It talks about Abel and talks about Daniel and Noah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and a woman named Rahab and just a whole bunch more. And it says how it worked out for some of these people, how their faithfulness worked out. These people who knew that trust plus obey equals faithfulness. It says that some of these people's faithfulness ended up leading to them being people who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, and who, through faith, administered justice and shut the mouth of lions and quenched the fury of the flames or escaped the edge of the sword, and people whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds pretty good. I'd love for a lot of those words to describe what me trusting and obeying would lead to. But don't miss the next part. Look what else it says happened to some others who trusted and obeyed. It said that others faced jeers and flogging. Others were chained and put in prison. Others were stoned to death, and sawed in two, put to death by the sword, ended up destitute, persecuted, mistreated. Now how's this message going for you? I mean, say what you want about the Bible, but it sure doesn't sugarcoat anything. Trust plus obey might lead to places and things that are gonna really stink. So if we don't know for sure that our obeying will have an outcome that we want, if we don't even have an iPhone picture of it turning out like we want, why do it? Why obey? Good question. Thanks for asking. Here's why we trust and obey. It also says in Hebrews, it says, these, meaning those people who trusted and obeyed, these were all commended for their faith. Now, commended for their faith. What does that mean? Another good question. Very sharp crowd. Very sharp crowd. One time, here's what it means. One time Jesus told this story about these servants who were entrusted to invest money on behalf of their master, their boss. For some, the return on investment was really huge. For others, not as much. But regardless of how well their investment, made money for the person they're investing for, when they did what he told them to do, they each got the same response. The master said to them, "Well done, good and faithful servant." It reminds me of a few years ago. A few years ago, we put together a launch team for a new campus of Community. As you know, we're a church, one church with multiple locations. And for this new campus, we had the right leadership. We had the right people. We had enough resources. But within 6 months of the launch, the new site had to be closed. The month after closing this new campus, we gathered all our leaders from all our campuses together for our monthly leadership community event. How many have ever been to leadership community? Show of hands. Okay, thank you. It's a blast. I mean, it's like a giant pep rally. Lots of wins being celebrated, lots of hooping it up, high fives all around. But this leadership community was different. I mean, we'd done what we believed God wanted us to do, and the result wasn't what we wanted, and wasn't what we thought God wanted at all. And I remember Dave, our lead pastor, getting up to talk about this. What else do you call it? This failure, this disappointment. And he said, what happens next is very important. How we respond as a church will be very telling. And he wanted on to explain how he was learning about faithfulness being more important than success. And he asked the staff and the key volunteers from this recently closed, failed campus to join him on stage at Leadership Community. I mean, this was a group of people who had sacrificed lots of days and lots of hours and lots of dollars and lots of blood, sweat, and tears, and gave just a big chunk of their lives to start a new church. And I remember it. Dave said, we all agreed we'd start this new site, and we all agreed it's what God wanted us to do. And with our prayer and our full support, this group of people went out and obeyed God. But the campus didn't grow and didn't thrive. One day we'll be able to ask God why, and he'll fully explain it to us. But until then, all we know is this. God doesn't call us to be successful. He calls us to be faithful. And then Dave said, because this team was faithful to the task that we challenged them to do and God called them to do, I want you to express your appreciation to them right now. And what happened next was awesome. I mean, hundreds of leaders just leapt as one person to their feet, clapping, cheering, giving this team who failed just this tremendous standing ovation. I mean, it was like they just won the lottery and donated it all to the church. But I believe that was not just positive attitude or some big group, some big group hug or pat on the back. I believe that was the Spirit of the living God saying to those people from that campus, well done, good and faithful servants. So here we go. Right now, where you sit, what is it for you? What could God be calling you to do with no guarantees of how it's going to turn out? No guarantees of what you're going to get. A lot of y'all know me. I know something about what it's like to obey without picks. I know what it's like to pour everything I feel like I've got into a failing marriage with the mother of my kids and still have the marriage fail miserably. I do know something about what it's like to do what I thought God wanted me to do and have it turn out just messed up. But what is it for you? What is it God wants you to do that you're scared or hesitant or just plain unwilling to do because you have no guarantee or don't believe that you'll be glad you obeyed? I mean, is it in your career, your marriage, your finances, your health, your parenting? Maybe it's that addiction that you need to get treatment for, but you don't because there's no guarantee that you'll be able to stay clean. You just don't want to go through all that, clean for a little while, relapse, clean for a little while, relapse. What is it for you right now? Folks, Bible doesn't sugarcoat it, and neither will we. Nobody's going to stand up here today and say, hey, it's going to be fine. It's going to be blue skies all the way. No way. Won't tell you what you're going to get if you obey. Because faithfulness is trust plus obey. So why do it? Why bid without picks? I can only think of one reason. Because there's nothing better in all the universe, in all of life, than to hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. If you're here today and you're in this obey God thing, like, if I do that for you, God, then you have to do that for me. I understand that. And God can work with you on that. But I just can't recommend that. If you want a return on investment that includes pics of what you want to see and get in this deal, eventually you're going to find you're barking up the wrong spiritual tree. But if God is or is more and more becoming a real person in your life, and you know that he's done so much for you that you'd be nothing and have nothing without him, you can be guaranteed what you'll get, not to see, but to hear. You'll get to hear the only one who really matters say to you, well done, good and faithful servant. And I want to say to somebody who's hurting right now because you tried to do what God wanted in your marriage or in your dating life or in your career or with your finances, and you feel either like you failed or maybe God failed you, I want to say to you, you obeyed God because you trusted God, and that's faithfulness. So well done, good and faithful servant. God's Spirit's speaking to somebody even now, right here in this moment. In the midst of your disappointment and pain, please hear the word of the Lord today to you. Well done, good and faithful servant. And please know that when you get right down to it, doesn't matter what anybody else has to say to you or about you. What matters is when he says to you, well done, good and faithful servant. I mean, you say for you, but I'll say for me. Obviously, I've had my share of bumps and bruises and heartaches and heartbreaks along the way, but God's been good to me. God's been there for me. I mean, for some inexplicable reason, he loves me. He loves me enough to give up his only son for me. And when it's all said and done, I really want to move more and more in the direction of living my life for an audience of one. I want to hear the one who loves me the most say the words that mean the most. Well, okay, actually second most. First most is hearing the Lord say to me, I'd rather die than live without you. So I did. That's the most important thing he's ever said to me. Changed my life. But the second most important thing is just the possibility of hearing him say, well done, good and faithful servant. Knowing that with God's help, I've lived my life more and more to please and be faithful to the one who loves me the most. I got a long way to go. Well, that's what makes obeying without picks worth it, because in the end, that's what means the most.